You're listening to the Omni Athlete Podcast, your source of peak performance techniques and actionable practices from the world's highest achieving mind, body, and spirit competitors. Join host Rich Walkoff, longtime NFL sportscaster for the San Francisco 49ers, on a journey to access your peak performance state and unlock sport as a transformational human experience. Welcome to Omni Athlete.
Well, I just got off the tennis court playing 2 hours of highly mediocre tennis, and I think I need an inner game coach. The first certified inner game coach ever, working with Tim Galway. So, Sean Brawley, welcome to Omni Athlete. And
Thank you.
I could have used you today.
Thank you. I think everybody needs an inner game coach.
What is an inner game coach? Let's start it right at the get-go.
Well, it's Tim Galway wrote the Inner Game of Tennis 45 years ago, actually, and he defines the inner game as the game played. There's always an outer game, where you want to beat your opponent and win more points or games, and but there's always an inner game going on that you want to become the master at, because that seems to be the most important game, and that's the one played against your own self-interference, your own different ways that you can get in your own way. And if you can reduce that self-interference, then performance actually has immediate improvements. And so it's a good game to play. It usually leads to more enjoyment and fulfillment as well. So.
Well, I noticed today, as I generally do, the monkey mind and that little voice in my head, I couldn't quiet at given times. And when I did, and when I do, better things happen. But turning off that little inner voice is such a challenge. It seems so simple, yet elusive for so many.
It is. And there's, I've been doing, this in this line of work. I started working with Tim. He was my mentor for about 5 years back in 93. And it is elusive. And there's two reasons for that. One is everybody thinks that because they're a human being, they should somehow be able to control their mind. Like it just should be part of the package. And number two, you played tennis. You said you play at a mediocre level, but there was a time when you were a beginner, right?
Well, sure. I made progress, but then I hit a plateau. So without getting too specific to my world, but so many people start as beginners, obviously, and then they develop a little more skill set. But plateauing is very common, right? And how do you bust through?
Well, it is, but what I wanted to circle back to is on this negative self-talk and any of the inner skills that are really important, like to develop the ability to focus and control attention, the ability to manage your mental and emotional state. It requires practice, and people don't practice it. That's the main thing. The main thing is very well that if you want, go from a beginner to a pretty decent tennis player, that it will take practice. It'll take some amount of coaching. It'll, competing might be part of the equation. But in terms of whether people are competing in sports or just, living daily life, they somehow think they can escape the whole practicing thing. But you have to practice inner skills if you want them to develop. And when you do, it's amazing the difference it can make in one's life and in one's sport. It's truly amazing.
Well, I know it is, because what separates the winners from the losers in the elite level is rarely pure skill. It's who can maximize the performance at the most pressure-packed time, or as Billie Jean King says, pressure is a privilege. So talk about some of the techniques that you use to get people more focused, more in the flow state when, the game's on the line or the match is at stake.
And again, I'm just going to say it in a different way, but if the time you want to utilize these tools or inner skills is like right now in competition and you haven't practiced, it'll be tough. The number one practice for me, based on my own experience, and I've been doing this for a long time, I've been meditating now for 9 years, 20 minutes a day when I wake up in the morning, sometimes longer. Every once in a while, if I can't sleep, I'll do it, in the middle of the night. But basically, my practice is first thing I do when I get up in the morning. What my experience is, and what the research shows, is that what it does is it has a great impact on your central nervous system, that most of us are carrying an enormous amount of stress that we actually don't realize. Now a lot of research is coming out that a lot of people, maybe even a majority of people, are walking around with what's called developmental trauma. Everybody's heard of PTSD, but not too many people have heard of this early developmental trauma, which is a chronic state in our families of not getting our needs met, and it actually creates like a stress or a trauma that's chronic. So the nervous system ends up coping with that and develops strategies that aren't effective for when we're adult. So when we meditate, we're really going into that sympathetic, what's called the parasympathetic system. There are two systems. The parasympathetic is the relaxed system. The sympathetic system is the stress, where that produces the adrenal and cortisol hormones. And so the more practice you get staying in your parasympathetic system, where everything that arises is okay, then you start developing, after about a year of doing it regularly, all of a sudden something really shifted, and I discovered a reference point, that I actually had a reference point. There was this shift of just a letting go, a deepening into relaxation, where I knew, no one had to tell me, wow, this is my normal state. Like, this is my normal state. This right here, not what I've been experiencing for the last 40 some odd years. And it became a reference point. So then from that point, when I would be out of alignment or off center, I at least understood like that I was, and I could do something to come back. So that's number one. That is the most powerful. It's my number one recommendation. I'm just curious, do you meditate at all or no?
Yeah, that's interesting, because everyone in my family does, my two sons and my wife, and I dabbled in it. One of my sons is very involved, and he gave me Tim Ferriss's book, Tools of Titans, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's a fascinating read, where Ferriss, who's a great visionary in his own right, talks with so many high achievers in a variety of different pursuits and fields. And the commonality was virtually all of those Jedis in business, sports, technology, entrepreneurship, whatever. Virtually all of them meditate.
I had heard of the book. I didn't realize that. That's really good to know. And I think it's finally gotten away from the spiritual connotation that a lot of people didn't, it kind of made people resist it. But it just from a very basic health, mental health, emotional health perspective, it's fantastic.
Yeah, now so you're tapping into the subconscious to release and calm things, I would gather. Can you just expound a little bit more about how you find that inner self that will manifest in better performance in tennis, life, or whatever?
Well, I believe that the foundation of excellence in all things is your mental emotional state, and that we could talk for a long time about describing that mental emotional state that's ideal. But the easiest is just relaxed focus. That when we're just feel like we're ourselves, when we're relaxed and it's like us playing, not somebody else and not someone jacked up on adrenaline and nerves. and we're focused, which is alert and energetic. So it's not relaxed. It's not like we're lethargic. It's this combination that's almost a contradiction. When we can achieve that state, there's a professor, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, wrote a book called Flow and really studied flow for 30 years. And, the neuroscience really shows that this is our optimal state for performing in everything. Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, he wrote a book 3.5 years ago called Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. Same thing. Everything he thought focus was critical for everything we do and learning about our emotions. So this is really important, to be able to learn how to manage our mind and our bodies so that we have a state of being where we feel good. Because when we feel good, we perform well.
Mm-hmm. So ironically, or not ironically, but pointedly, getting the mind out of the way and letting that inner self express itself or oneself in the physical pursuit or whatever you're doing. Is that a fair way to say it?
That is, and it's I think it's, for me, it's important to emphasize that when we say get the mind out of the way, it's it's the part of the mind that tends to interfere a lot, which is generally what we believe now is it's mostly the left side of the brain. It's the thinking, rational side of the brain that seems to constantly want to control our actions. It berates us when we make mistakes. But, there's this other place that we can go to that's beyond thought, that's much more intuitive, where the body is able, without all of that thinking and analyzing and judging, it seems to do pretty damn well all on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that old line, when you think, you stink.
I haven't heard that one, actually.
No, well, that nails it right there in what you're saying. Yeah. So you, as an elite tennis player in your day, Wimbledon, U.S. Open, and playing against the best in the world, had you had this understanding and this wisdom, or is it something that you learned through your trials and tribulations as a tennis pro?
No, I unfortunately didn't have it. It would have made a huge impact on my game and on my ranking. I was known as a thinking player in the positive way. I was very strategic, and I would pick up on tactics and strategies, which some call part of the mental game, but I think it's a separate category myself. I got off the tour in 85, 86, and I didn't meet Tim until 93, and that was shortly before that I read the book for the first time. And so, yeah, it really helped a lot.
Yeah, but unfortunately not when you were an athlete. not when you were competing. So tell me about that education curve, if you will. So you retire from professional tennis, unfortunately not with the wisdom that you later learned, but how did that evolve?
So I was in business for about 5 or 6 years, but got back, didn't like it. So I got out and went back into tennis as a coach. And around that same time, I had been playing a lot of local tournaments in Los Angeles area where I lived. And, fresh off the tour, for many years, I won most of the local tournaments because I had played at USC as one of the best players in the world. So I won a lot of tournaments locally. And then all of a sudden I went into a slump and I started losing to people that I had never, ever lost to ever in my life. And my ego took a huge hit and I was going crazy and I needed something, and so I finally read the book. And then the next tournament I played, I won the tournament. I beat it was a tournament in Northern Cal. I beat the number 3 player at Berkeley, the number 1 Northern Cal player, and won $1,500. And then I said, oh my God, this was transformational. I got to try to meet the author. This is just amazing. So I tried in all the conventional ways and wasn't successful. And then I ended up seeing a friend of mine who was one of 4 guys that gave me money to go out on the tour some, what was it, 11 years before, but I hadn't seen him in like 5 or 6 years. Turned out to be Tim Galway's cousin. He had never told me. Never ever told me at all. Didn't give me the book when I went on the tour. Gave me a kick in the butt, but didn't give me the book. And so I was like, "Oh, you're into all this stuff? You probably want to meet my cousin." I was like, "Oh my God, are you kidding me?" And then that was it. I met him, and Tim offered to mentor me, and we had a great mentoring relationship for 5 years. And then we've done projects off and on for the last 15 to 17 years.
That's great. Well, remember, there are no coincidences, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That was a harmonic convergence. So take us through some of the steps of your immersion in the inner game of Tim Galway was bringing to you. How did it develop for you?
Well, I did it. I learned it first, on the tennis court and as a coach, and I also considered myself like a living laboratory, both as a coach and a player, because I was still playing. As a coach, I still remember the first lesson that I ever had, or I ever gave after Tim agreed to mentor me. And I think it's a good one as an example of the shift of what we normally think of coach. Because we normally think of coaching as someone with an expert knowledge, like of technique, who imparts that knowledge by teaching, maybe demonstrating, but mostly teaching and telling us how to do stuff. The teacher compares the model of right and wrong that they have in their head. They watch the student's behavior or the athlete's behavior, and then they go about giving those prescriptive instructions to try to chisel them into the model that they have. The weird thing, of course, is there's many examples in all sports of people with really great technique who can't win. So something else actually absolutely has to be happening underneath. So in this first lesson, it was with a beginner, Nancy, and when I first tossed her some balls, she missed the ball completely, like 2 or 3 times, and then hit the ball on the outside frame of her racket the whole rest of the time. She didn't hit one ball on the middle of her racket. So I'm watching her do this, and I've got one, as I say, I got one foot in the old way of coaching, which is I go, oh God, what am I going to do about this? The only instruction that we know that anybody ever says is watch the ball. And we know that doesn't help at all. It doesn't make a player watch the ball to tell them to watch the ball better. So as I'm trying to figure out what to do, I realize that, this other kind of thing comes up. And I just asked myself, I should check with her where she thinks she's hitting the ball. What a novel concept to actually check in with them on what they're thinking or experiencing or feeling. So I asked her, I said, Nancy, where do you think you're hitting the ball? And she pointed to the middle of the racket. So that was pretty big for me, that there was this distortion, in her perception. And of course, had I said something like, watch the ball, or gave her feedback that she was hitting it on the frame, that wouldn't have made a lot of sense, because her experience was that she was hitting it right in the center. So I went on the other side, and I demonstrated bouncing the ball and hitting it on my racket, and then letting it bounce and hitting it again, so that it's doing that, it's much easier to have contact with the strings. So I asked her to do that. She was able to do that. And I said, so what does it feel like when it hits the strings? And she said, it feels springy. I said, oh, great. So now I'm going to go back over there. I'm going to toss some balls. And you tell me if it feels springy or something else. So she did her habit again, and she hit the ball, mostly on the outside of the frame and missed it. But this time something happened where, and the fast version is, her responses were thud, 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 miss, thud, springy, springy, thud, thud, miss, thud, springy, 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 thud, springy, 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 springy. And I didn't say a word. And I'm watching this happen, and I just thought it was the most amazing thing. And all it is, it's still amazing, but this is how natural learning actually happens. And as a coach or teacher, when you work with how our mind is really set up and how we really learning actually is incredibly fast and easy.
Is this part of the guided discovery approach that you use in teaching?
That's exactly one way to describe it. What I just described is actually not even, you could even argue that it's not guided, but I guess it is, yeah. Because what the inner game introduced me to was just the self-discovery, where I ask the person, what are you noticing? And they say, oh, I'm noticing my shoulder. And I say, oh, well, pay attention to your shoulder. What do you notice about it? Oh, it's tight. Well, keep paying attention. See how, so there's even, this whole discovery approach is just so beautiful.
Yeah. And then that segues into what you call awareness-based exercises. Is that a kind of a cousin?
Yes, exactly. And you've done your homework. My hat's off to. Yeah, absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that, if you will.
Well, this gets back. You had asked before about tools, and I'd mentioned, meditation. But the second one would be greater self-awareness. People are calling it mindfulness today, but any time that we develop awareness of what we're doing and we really bring our presence to what we're doing, we can't do it the same way ever again. Number one, it's got to change. And number two, we can't change anything we're not aware of. And when I mean aware, I don't mean someone just telling you. It means you know it from your own experience.
Right.
So that's the foundation of it.
So from the hacks that are newbies to the game to sitting down with Roger Federer, Venus Williams, and other greats in the world, must have been a fascinating exchange. And Fed is a hero of many who love the game of tennis. And you got to share some insights that he shared with you, and some of the the inquisitive nature of your conversation related to the inner game for him.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it was fascinating because for some reason, like I had interviewed several players before him, and even though I haven't really interviewed people before, I've coached hundreds of people, but I've never really interviewed on camera this way. I did fine with the previous three players, but when it was my turn to interview Federer, I was as nervous as I think I might have ever been. It was so bizarre to feel that way. So I opened up by just saying I wanted to, basically talk to you about your development of your craft and the mental game. And I didn't even really ask a question, but then he started talking for about a minute of how he started, and I was like, oh God, thank God, because I was I had a chance to catch my breath, to set my posture, and then all of a sudden I really calmed down. And the thing that was interesting, some of the highlights for me of the interview was when he specifically with him, it was that anger was a real issue for him when he was younger. There was a period of time where he actually consciously worked on managing his anger, and that actually is what has allowed him to kind of have a pretty huge jump. And then shortly thereafter, he won Junior Wimbledon, which he described as a breakthrough experience. That experience really transformed the way he thought and believed in himself. He developed a confidence and a sense of, I can really do this. I can play my best tennis on this big stage. And apparently he hadn't had that before. What was interesting to me was the fact that all of the players had a breakthrough experience. All of them had a tournament or a match, and all different. So like Grigor Dimitrov is 3 in the world right now. His breakthrough, one of his breakthroughs happened in a $10,000 futures tournament shortly after being in a slump. He won this tournament, suddenly just transformed the way he thought about himself and felt about himself, and then he won 5 or $25,000 challenger tournaments in a row, which is like still never been done. That's like amazing, even at that level. It's like that's a level of consistency that's impossible, like really, And then he's just been on a rise ever since. Gael Monfils, who was 6 in the world when I interviewed him, but he's now 46 in the world. He won the Australian Open Junior, the French Open Junior, and Wimbledon Junior, and that wasn't enough. Like that didn't do it. His breakthrough experience he described was losing to Andre Agassi in 3 sets when Agassi was number 1 in the world, and somehow that match did it for him. So that was fascinating.
I'm sure. So these epiphanies are really critical to the development. But can you go back to Federer talking about the angst and the anger and managing his emotions better? Because some athletes are fueled by that and others are undone by it.
Yeah, it's true. Anger at its root is really just an energy. So some people use anger to really energize themselves, and but in my experience, anger for the vast majority of people I've ever worked with, it gets in the way, and it's a limiting factor for how far you're going to get in your sport. He didn't dive into like specific things he did to overcome his anger. I think the most important thing that seemed to come out of it was just his acknowledging it finally, because he knew he had a temper problem for a long time.
He could curse in 5 languages.
So I think just what happened was there came a point where, after hearing it many times from his coach, something in him finally believed that this was a problem. And so that's when he consciously started to just try to shift and change. And, as we've already talked, I think the awareness and the acknowledgement of that, admitting it, accepting it, I think was pretty big for him.
Yeah. So there's 2 schools of thought on the emotional response to success or failure. You could have elation or dejection that can work one of 2 things. It could either fuel you or derail you. And again, it's different for different people. But do you embrace the theory that play every point in that neutral, kind of disconnected mindset? So whether you made the great shot or missed the easy shot, you don't get too high or too low, as the common phrase. Or do you think that having that emotional release, good, bad, or indifferent, for a few seconds can be a healthy response?
It's a great question. I think it's one of the key questions for the mental game, for learning how to win the mental game. I think that the most important starting point is for a person to be themselves. So whatever their disposition is, they need to be themselves. So some people can get into trouble if, for instance, they're angry, because the old school was don't get angry. So a lot of athletes would start to get angry and then they'd put a lid on it. So repressing your anger absolutely doesn't help. And it really, in the long run, can really hurt. It can hurt if you're, express, say, your anger and do it and go overboard. That doesn't help either. That can really just take you out of the whole competition. So I don't believe in the neutral either. I actually, part of why I was in that slump I talked about was because I was reading about yoga, and I went into this detached and like, oh wow, look at my beautiful strokes, look at how beautiful this point is, and I couldn't win a frickin' match, you know. So I started to get really frustrated, and I think that the Federer is actually a really good example. Tiger Woods, until his mishap, he was the prime example that I would use, because he would give the fist pump when he would sink a putt, but then he would show getting upset and getting frustrated and getting angry and getting pissed if he missed an easy putt. And I think the key is, with his what I've read about his training, his father said, you can get angry, Tiger. That's not a problem. But you can only be angry for 10 steps. So you've got to figure out how to manage that anger so it doesn't linger to your next shot. But by all means, if you're angry, that's a natural reaction to missing an easy putt. I've got two friends who wrote Heads Up Baseball, Ken Ravizza and Tom Hansen. They've worked with some of the very top players in baseball, and they have the same philosophy. It's, you can get angry if you miss the pitch, but, when you go and, fix your hat, which is part of their routine to start their pitching routine, it's got to be done. It's got to be finished. So that's what I believe. I believe that, you want to be human out there and be yourself, but you do need to manage it, and that's different.
Yeah. Kind of the old mindset of what you resist persists. So you don't want to suppress and repress, but if you get it out, I'm a pretty passionate guy when I play, and I think it parallels, I would like to think, my life. And at times I can get a little too exultant or a little too down, and I try to limit that, as you say, give it 5 or 10 seconds and then take a deep breath and on to the next point or the next matter in your life. And I would embrace that too, and I think most people would. So you also, I gotta draw the parallels between baseball and tennis. With hitting a baseball is, in the eyes of many, one of the most challenging things in all of sports. But a ball is coming at your bat much the way a ball is coming to a tennis racket. And you work with the Yankees in their developmental program for minor leaguers and newly signed players. And tell me about the parallels that you see that were applicable for both sports, tennis and baseball.
Well, there's real direct application. In fact, the first time when I was in the training center in Tampa, there were 35 coaches, many of them former big leaguers, and I got introduced, and then I said a few opening remarks and said, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to ask away. And one of the coaches immediately raised his hand and said, Mr. Brawley, with all due respect, as a former tennis pro, what can you teach us about baseball? And my hand started shaking. I remember putting it in my pocket so they wouldn't see it. And then this intuitive voice said, just tell the truth. So I said, oh, that's a good idea. So I did. I said, well, not much, because I don't have an eye for baseball technique and the little subtle things that are contributing to what might be a problem like you do. But let me ask you a question. What do you think the number one most critical skill is needed to be an extraordinary baseball hitter? Not a good one and not a great one, but extraordinary. And they were all set up, and I put them into threes, and they talked about it. It's the only time ever in any situation anyone has been unanimous. Like even just a few years later, when I was back doing the same program, they had different coaches and they had like 20 different answers, which is something, it means something else. But in this case, they were unanimous. And it was reading the pitch. And I said, great. So reading the pitch is the number one most critical skill. So, I don't know how often you're having them, what you're doing around this. So I need to find out. So let me ask you a follow-up question. How often are you having the players practice reading the pitch? And the guy who asked the question, his jaw dropped. And then I saw a couple other jaw drops, and then a coach asked the question, well, gee, Mr. Brawley, we don't really have enough time. It's, our practice schedule is packed. We don't have room for anything else. I said, wow, that's really a shame. You don't have room to practice the number one most important thing. And then another coach said, well, when they're when they're doing pitching practice, we usually stick somebody in there to just, because somebody standing there is more challenging than if nobody's there. And that guy usually just chats up the catcher. So we could actually have him practice reading the pitch. And I said, well, this is why I'm here. I don't know a lot about baseball, but I know a lot about learning and coaching. And, this is what we're going to do today. So in terms of hitting, the key difference in baseball, although they're used to it at that level, is that baseball hurts when it hits you. Tennis ball doesn't hurt that much,
True. Yeah.
Man, that thing is like, especially those curveballs that look like they're coming at you, and then they curve away. But that being said, the most critical thing as a hitter is reading that pitch, is being able to perceive what kind of a pitch it's going to be as early as possible. Second is plate awareness, which they still don't understand fully, in my opinion, even after all these years. When I got done with the Yankees, I thought, well, gee, I just did a successful thing with the Yankees. I might be doing some more stuff. I better start learning about baseball. So I went and bought The Science of Hitting by Ted Williams. Right in the middle of the book, it's Ted Williams. He split the plate up into 16 sections, and he's got his batting average in every one of those 16 sessions. So wow. Because of that, he knew what pitch he was going to wait for.
Right.
And he would not hit certain pitches. And when he knew they were, so I was like, oh my God, here it is. And that's what I'm really good at, is noticing these types of things where this should be, in every player development, because that's the second most important thing, is to have this plate awareness. That same kind of awareness that when you're parallel parking the car, you can't see the corner of your car, but you can feel it. It's like it's part of your butt, man. You're driving, you can feel, where the corner of your car is as you're parallel parking.
Right.
So
that's very cool. I mean, the Splendid Splinter, they said he could see the rotation of the ball and would see which commissioner's name was printed on the ball. The last guy to hit 400 in 1941. Just unbelievable talent. And you hear about the art of pitching and the science of hitting. And I'm sure that was brought up in your discussions with the Yankees in the developmental realm of things. That is truly the case. There's a science to hitting. And when Ted Williams didn't want to hit a pitch that the pitcher wanted him to hit, he was playing his card. He was playing his stronger card. So that's a great tool. It's interesting that the coaches were telling you, we don't have time for the things that are most important. How ironic, huh?
Well, so they knew that one. They weren't doing anything at all around plate awareness. So we created a couple of simple tools. That's basically how I helped them go from 23 to number one. And like with, the thing that I found fascinating too is that I started working with the Yankees in 2001, and that was right around when Moneyball came out. And they still, to this day, don't realize that, and I didn't finish the third one. For a hitter, the third one is being clear where you're going to hit the ball. So like once you've read the pitch, if you try to hit the ball to a location that isn't conducive for the pitch itself, that could be a problem. That could be, that could get in the way. So to be very clear, like when the pitch is where you want it, what you're going to do with it can help. Those three things, reading the pitch, plate awareness, and being clear of your intention, is why Moneyball, players exist. These players that look like they aren't athletic, but they're able to get on base and make contact with the ball. They're skillful in these three skills that are not noticeable.
Yeah, I am not a huge advocate of the sabermetrics, the algorithms on hitting performance in this situation. Do you go the overshift, whatever? I think it kind of it trumps some of the intrinsic awareness and gut feeling about the game of baseball, and it really in all sports. How much do you value the statistics and that analysis versus just the feel and the sense you have of the moment? And I know it's a combined kind of formula, but how much do you accentuate one over the other?
So what is the specific question? I just want to make sure.
I'm just curious. Some people are wedded to the numbers and the sabermetrics and the algorithms. In this situation, you're most likely to have this result if you do this, and others will just more old school, trust the gut, be more intuitive or following their instincts on whatever experience they've had in the past and how they think it'll impact what's going to happen in that given moment. So, kind of the science and the art, the contrast and the combination of the two. How would you gauge your focus in that regard in a given experience?
Yeah. So for me, I'm not normally into metrics. I'm not normally into technique anymore. I'm interested in helping the person develop that mental emotional state and to practice the inner skills that shape technique. In terms of these like sabermetrics, as you refer to them, they were helpful for one reason, in my opinion, which is they discovered that that this intuitive gut approach hadn't yielded to the most important metric, which is on base percentage. At the time Moneyball came out, there was only a couple of people that were actually using metrics and they discovered that the on base percentage is the critical factor. So then again, the athletes, the hitters that aren't so athletic, they have like not such great technique, but they have an amazing on-base percentage. They're very valuable to your team. And I just want to reiterate again, in my opinion, the reason they get on base so often is because they're reading the pitch really well. They may not even realize they're reading the pitch really well because it's this inner experience. They may assume everybody can do it in that way.
Yeah.
But, you get this overweight guy who keeps getting the bat on the ball. That's pretty helpful.
Sure. And, Billy Beane was big on, as you pointed out, working deep into the count and make the pitcher labor. And more often than not, many times they'd falter and you get, as you say, guys would get on base and then it's, you're in the advantageous position. Let's switch gears a little bit. You worked with a guy who is now perceived in most NFL circles as one of the elite coaches in the game, but it wasn't always that way for Pete Carroll as he stumbled after being a defensive coordinator with the 49ers, a team that I was involved with for many years in the broadcast, with the Patriots and the Jets. It didn't pan out, and boom, in Seattle, he is transformed a franchise.
He has, and before that, he he was the head coach at SC, and I actually met him a year before he got the job at SC, and he hired two people. He hired a football expert, and he hired me. He thought that the inner game was the foundation of his coaching philosophy, but didn't actually, admittedly know how or what that was. So he hired me as the inner game expert to help tease out his philosophy. As he tells it, he had an epiphany. He was reading John Wooden's Blue Book, and he just got to this point where he realized, wow, before John Wooden won 11 national championships for UCLA, he didn't actually win very much before that. He didn't win a championship, but he had this philosophy. And when he, his insight was that once John Wooden knew how to win, he won a lot. And he realized that after getting fired twice, he didn't know why he got fired. He didn't really know the underlying core reasons why, as a head coach, he got fired. As a defensive coordinator, he could intuitively, he didn't know all the reasons why he was the best defensive coordinator in the NFL either, but he could do that. He could do that forever. I mean, his defenses were typically in the top 5, When he went to the 49ers, he helped them win a Super Bowl that year by helping the defense become one of the best. So I just helped him kind of get clear about his coaching philosophy, and it gets back to the same thing. The most, in terms of sustainable high performance, the most important driver is identifying what's critical and then focusing all the attention on that. So, whether it's a ball's coming to me and I make sure I'm present and focused on reading that ball or the pitch. And then as you get into macro settings like team practice, it's making sure that you're practicing the most important things. So, for instance, one of the reasons he discovered that he was number one defensive coordinator is he had identified 2 or 3 really critical factors for all great defenses. 2 of them are you could call metrics. I'm curious, in terms of defense, what are 2 ways that they measure a defense that if, it's really clear whether you're excelling or not? Do you have a sense of what that means?
Well, sure. How many points you surrender and how you do in the red zone and on third down and key situations like that, fourth quarter performance and such. Yeah,
those are all important, but what Pete, in his own mind, discovered what he thought was the 2 most important were penalties, like what really determines the outcome. Because this is where he does believe in the inner game. He actually said that most teams that win aren't the better team. The team that wins because the other team generally does not play up to normal. Mm-hmm. They play worse than normal. And of course, there are exceptions to that, but I've been watching, for a number of years now, and that seems to hold pretty true. And the way you can determine whether a team is, playing up to normal or not is penalties and turnovers. Those are the 2 critical factors. So right. He has his defenses practice, they have umpires on the field that had not really been done before at SC. And they would make sure that they were limiting their penalties and that they would practice taking the ball away. And and then the third was making sure, because he believed that eventually teams would make a mistake, he wanted to give them room for that mistake. And so what he did was he protected against the big play. He would have the quarterbacks play deep and not and really try his best not to allow a big play. He'd give up the 3, 5, 7 yards and let them drive down the field because in his experience, most teams couldn't do that on a consistent basis. If they could, they'd be the best team.
Those are great insights. Absolutely true. And when you have at Seattle with the Legion of Boom in the day with Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor and company, and it's a Russian cover league in the NFL, and the takeaway is so key. So Pete Carroll, also a disciple of Michael Murphy and a great friend of the human potential movement. And you think about a team like a sport like football and a team sport where it is a tribal experience. And I think Pete has tapped into that so well in getting the best of the individual to coalesce with the group and the we, not me. And it is probably one of his greatest assets as a coach.
Well, I totally agree. It's interesting. You used the word tribal, and I was fascinating when I first interviewed him when he was telling me about his philosophy, because he believes in what he calls the long body, which is very tribal. The idea that what happens to one of the tribe happens to everybody. There isn't a distinction, and that he's trying to instill that idea and that feeling with the players. So, for instance, when he first went to USC, the first thing he did was he turned on the lights at the Coliseum. He had all the players and coaches over there at midnight. And offense and defense, they had tug of war, big rope, all these big players. It was raucous, rowdy, back and forth. And at the end, the defense, as I recall, pulled the offense across the line and celebrated. And afterwards, Pete asked them, so what's the lesson? And they came up with all these things, perseverance, strength, teamwork. And he said, no, that's not it. You guys are a team. If this happens at any time during the season, you can't win. You have to work together. This isn't offense against defense. This isn't seniors against freshmen. This isn't, you guys are one team. There is no competition, like in the sense, you can't fight each other. You have to support each other and really cooperate. And one of the other things that you mentioned this whole idea of the long body. So like knowing that really helped him get to one of the most important things he discovered, which was one of the reasons he didn't last at the Jets and in New England is because he didn't have control. He didn't have hiring and firing decisions. So when these $1 million athletes didn't want to do what he said, he had no recourse. He couldn't do anything to get them to actually cooperate. So at SC, when he interviewed for the job, he told them, he said, I need total control. Otherwise I can't come. He had discovered that. And so by having that control, then he can actually make those hiring and firing decisions and create that long body. So he started at Seattle, I think, what was it, 2006 or 7?
I'm not sure offhand, but around that time.
And so 5 years, so he won the Super Bowl a few years ago. Do you know how many people were on the Super Bowl team? How many players were on the Super Bowl team from the first year that he took over?
Well, John Schneider, the GM, was making wholesale changes. I bet he probably had just a couple.
Yeah, 0.
All right.
Because he's constantly tinkering to make sure that he's got the right people like on the team that are really conducive to that whole, what you would describe as the not me, we, but also is there a chemistry? Is there a fit? So it's really important aspect that a lot of coaches don't realize.
Yeah, it just reminds me of Phil Jackson, the Zen Buddhist approach, and
yeah,
he's burning incense and having the team kind of chant and goes to a Native American Indian, ritualistic approach to preparing for a game or a contest. And just fascinating how Phil Jackson couldn't get a job forever and is now the winningest coach in the NBA. Pete Carroll stumbles the first 2 times he tries to become an NFL head coach and is now considered among the best. And as we wrap this up, Sean, it's been fascinating and you have some great insights. We talk about the flow state, and you mentioned that great teacher from the University of Chicago, and you can pronounce his name better than I, perhaps. But tell me a little more about achieving that everyone wants to get in the zone. And our colleague Scott Ford says, getting in the zone by choice, not chance. What are some of the tools and mechanisms that you think in a little primer that the average athlete can draw upon?
Well, so in terms of the flow state or the zone, it generally comes on by grace. There isn't, I know that there are a lot of people in my profession, they offer services or programs to get into the zone, quickly and easily. And that's really BS. I mean, it takes practice. And we know that there are a couple of really critical things. One is that you have to be clear about the goal. You have to be clear about why you're doing what you're doing and what you want to accomplish. The second thing that's important is how do you perceive it, the level of difficulty. So if you perceive, okay, perfect example. Grigor Dimitrov was 9 in the world when I interviewed him. He was the first guy I interviewed. I was totally fine. So why did I get nervous when it was time to interview Roger Federer? It was my perception that had changed. It was nothing else. My perception changed. I perceived interviewing him somehow in a different way. Somehow I was at more risk, or it was threatening, or is too great of a challenge in some way for me. I don't know exactly why, but all I do know, I got nervous. So I just want to go back, because I really think, based on how many years I've been doing this and the typical athlete's belief and way of thinking about this is off. You have to practice mental skills if you want to get better at them. You must practice focusing if you want to get better at it. You must practice staying relaxed in times of pressure if you want to get better at it. So, and the other thing is that learning is progressive, which actually fits really well with Csikszentmihalyi's method, or his model. His model is that on the vertical axis, you've got the perceived challenge, and on the bottom, you have the perceived level of safety. So, for instance, if a situation is if an employee goes in to see the manager, is called in to see the manager, and suddenly they feel threatened, they're not going to have a good meeting. So if that level of safety or threat is high, then people will be anxious. They have no chance at the zone state or the ideal performance state. If this event is perceived as too great a challenge, they also won't be able to achieve that zone state. So on one, if the perceived event is too safe, they'll get bored. So there really is this kind of, you could call it a razor's edge, a fine line of this thin zone. This is why it's so difficult, because if you go too far one way, you're going to get bored and lose focus, and if you go the other way, you get anxious.
Right.
So the best thing to do is to really learn how to develop this relaxed focus and learn how to calm down your nervous system. Manage your self-talk is one of the critical things, because if you're beating yourself up and you're not your own cheerleader, you've just created a very difficult inner environment.
Right.
So these three things, practicing meditation, which covers all of it, learning how to control your focus, learning how to come back when you've lost focus, that's critical. Managing your self-talk so that you don't beat yourself up so much. That's really these three things. If people could master these three things, oh my God,
that would be it.
That would be it. That's the holy grail. Those three things right there. That's
right. You got the brass ring. So you kind of hearkening back to the old theory of responding, not reacting in a given situation. You have a conditioned response that is in harmony with your practice rather than the external factors taking you off your game, if you will.
Yeah. It's in part. So part of this is also learning, what's within your control and controlling that and letting go of all those things that are out of your control.
We call this interview the Omni Athlete because we believe in the totality of the human expression on the court or the field or whatever you're doing is the mind, the body, the spirit, and beyond. So how would you summarize your feelings about the Omni Athlete and what it takes to maximize the moment when the pressure is the greatest, the stakes are the highest, and you want to achieve and get that holy grail?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned it before, but the most important thing is to really just be able to be yourself. As Pete Carroll would describe it, just be normal. All I want is your normal, everyday self out there. Don't try to be better than you are. Don't try to play the best you've ever played. Just play normal and trust that that will be good enough to win. Now, on another hand, of course, he wants, his athletes to play really well. But what he's discovered is that as soon as you try to go away from your comfort zone in competition and do more than you actually can do or think you can do, you're in trouble. We haven't talked about it specifically, but the system that is the biggest issue for us is the fight, flight, freeze system. And our brain is set up to detect threats. It's set up to detect threats, which triggers the fight, flight, freeze system. Once that's triggered, we cannot have optimal performance. So we must learn how to just be ourselves and be comfortable with that and not play all these inner games of trying to look good and trying to, be perfect. And, there's so many that we could talk about. So it's just, that's the key. One of the main keys, you'll solve so many problems that could potentially be interfering if someone can just learn how to just be themselves while they're playing. That's number one. Know who you are and be that person. You'll be fine.
That's great. Sean, this has been fascinating. You got some great insights. A pleasure talking with you and meeting you today. It was
You too, Rich. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Again, really appreciate it. Have a good one, man.